My wife, Victoria, it, yeah, she is very pregnant. She is very pregnant. Our son, Grant, is getting evicted on the 15th, one way or the other. And she's so tough. Like, Victoria doesn't complain. And it's been amazing to watch. Like, she'll be so tired that she will fall asleep on the couch while our daughter is jumping all over her. And she doesn't complain. Like, just the other day, she was doubled over, feeling a contraction. And as soon as it stopped, she's like, all right, time to decorate our whole house for fall. And I'm like, that's incredible. She's tough as nails. I am not like that. I'm like the stereotypical guy that when I get a cold, it's over. Like, I get leveled when I'm sick. As soon as I don't feel good, everybody knows about it. I get dramatic. Like, if you were to come into my bedroom when I was sick, you would think you walked into a funeral. Like, the blinds are closed. There's soft music playing. There's candles lit. Like, it's very dramatic. Like, last time I had a cold, I'm in my bed, and Victoria comes in. She's bringing me some broth. And she comes in, and she sees me typing on my phone. And she's like, well, what are you doing? And I'm like, I'm getting my affairs in order. I'm working on my will. And she's like, yeah, okay. And, walks out. Rightly so. But as soon as I, don't feel good physically, it's not just my physical body that struggles. I struggle emotionally, I struggle mentally, and I struggle with my faith, too. Like, when I'm suffering, my faith struggles. Like, just the other month, I had a little bit of a health thing that I had to go to the doctor for. And it was extremely mild. Like, this was no big deal. But of course, I looked it up on WebMD and convinced myself that I was dying of cancer. And I started spiraling, and I'm like, God, why? Why would you do this to me? And Victoria's rolling her eyes. And I'm like, and I just started struggling. And I realized, man, this time when I need to feel closest to God is when I feel the furthest away from Him. When we suffer in our lives, a lot of times our relationship with Jesus struggles too. And I don't think that's just me. Like, for you, maybe it's not when you every time you have a cold, but maybe when you're going through hard times, your relationship with Jesus can struggle. Maybe for you, it's when you don't pass a test or get into the school that you want. Then it's tough to trust God. Maybe your marriage is going through a hard season, and for you, that means it's tough to trust God. Maybe you're sick, or you're hurting. Maybe you're broke. Maybe there's something going on in your life where you're like, this is really hard to trust God right now. But when we're going through suffering is the time that we need to feel closest to Him, not the farthest away from Him. So what do we do? What do you do? And here's a sad truth. And a reality that we all have to kind of grapple with is that one day we will all die. And how do we face that suffering? Still trusting God. How do we face death and trust God through that? Today, in our What is Heaven Like series, we're going to look at this story in Luke. And the hope is that if you remember this account that Jesus experienced on the cross, when you're going through suffering, it will help you better be able to trust God through the suffering. Our big idea that we're going to look at today is that we need to remember the other cross. If you're taking notes, this is the thing to write down. Remember the other cross. A little bit of context. We're going to be reading Luke chapter 23. Jesus has lived His life. He has been put on trial and convicted, found guilty of a crime that He didn't commit. They convicted Him of heresy, pretending to be God. And now they have taken Him out of the city of Jerusalem, and we jump in verse 32 of Luke chapter 23, which says, 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with Him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified Him there, along with the criminals, one on His right and the other on His left. So, for the Romans, Jesus was just another guy. And on that day, they had these other criminals that were to be executed. They never did it within Jerusalem. They did it outside of Jerusalem in a place that's appropriately called the Skull. That's where they committed all of their executions. They liked that spot because it was next to the busiest road, so everybody coming into the town would see what happens to people who broke the law. Jesus is taken there. They crucified him, which means they put nails through his hands, through his feet. They put him up on the cross. It was a slow, painful, torturous, shameful way to die. Notice, Luke is a very meticulous author. He doesn't put things in there that aren't important. And so did you see how he mentioned 2 times that Jesus was with criminals? He made a point of saying it, that the criminals were led out with him to be executed, and he even tells us the physical location of these 2 other random people with Jesus. One person on his right and the other person on his left. When the Bible tells us something twice, anytime you're reading Scripture, that means we got to pay close attention because God is trying to teach us something. It's kind of like when my wife tells me something twice. Like, if she's like, Will, I'd really like some ice cream right now. And I'm like, yeah, okay. But then she goes, no, Will, I'd really like some ice cream. And oh, okay, I better get some ice cream. So when God tells us something twice, we got to pay close attention. So remember the fact that it's important that criminals were with Jesus. Put a pin in it. We're going to come back to it. It's going to be a full circle moment at the end. But then Jesus, on the cross, prays one of the most amazing prayers that he ever does. Jesus says, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. There's only 2 people that Luke tells us that Jesus talks to while he's on the cross. And the first one is he's praying to God. He's talking to his Father. Now, wherever you're at in your faith, maybe you're here and you're not so sure about Jesus, maybe you're skeptical about God, whatever, but I'm willing to bet that if you were being tortured to death, even you might start praying. It's kind of like when the plane experiences turbulence. Like, no one's an atheist then. Everyone's like, oh, I'm willing to bet that everybody here, if they were undergoing that kind of suffering, would probably pray. But here's my question to you. What would you say? You might say something like, God, help me. Make this go quickly. You might say, God, make a miracle happen and rescue me. Like at an action movie, the last second, somebody whoops in, so jumps in and saves you. You might be hoping for that, but that is not what Jesus prays. He says, Father, forgive them. Jesus is praying for forgiveness for the people that are murdering him. He's showing us what it really means to love your enemies. Don't miss how impactful that is. And he says that they don't know what they're doing. Now, the people who were murdering Jesus, they knew what they were doing. They knew that what they were doing to him. But what they didn't know is the full gravity of the evil they were committing by killing God. The people who were killing Jesus knew that they were killing an innocent man, but they didn't know what God was going to do through him. And this is part of the upside-down kingdom of heaven that is so amazing, where things look one way to us, but then in reality, they are something different. Because these people were murdering an innocent man, but God, through the murder of an innocent man, was going to make a way for guilty people to live. God is going to bring through murder life. He's going to bring through evil forgiveness and mercy. But they don't make it easy on Jesus to pray for forgiveness for them. In fact, they make it just about as hard as humanly possible. They divided up his clothes by casting lots. They're betting on who gets to win Jesus' clothes. The people are watching. The rulers even sneered at him. They're making fun of him. They said, he saved others, let him save himself if he is God's Messiah, the chosen one. The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, if you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. There was written a notice above him which read, this is the king of the Jews. Everyone is mocking, laughing, causing Jesus to experience shame. Now, for the Romans, they would put the plaque above the person who was being executed, and it would list the crime by which they committed that they're being executed for. And for Jesus, they're mocking him. They say, this is the King of the Jews. This is the crime that Jesus committed. It's hard for us to understand exactly what's happening here, but Jesus is being stripped not only of his life, but also of his dignity. And in their culture, that was everything. He's being tortured physically, mentally, and emotionally in every possible way. The soldiers give him this nasty wine. It tastes like vinegar. It's not good, but it's not just that it tastes nasty. What they're trying to do is prolong his suffering by giving him something to drink. They're extending his suffering on the cross. And as dark as this scene is, here's what's so important. As dark as this scene is, there's almost this strange undercurrent in it that's ironic. It's almost like a dark comedy because these people are mocking him, but even the sign they put above his head is the truth. What they put above his head for condemnation is actually a proclamation of who he is. And notice this, every person is telling him, if you are who you say you are, then save yourself. The soldiers say it. The rulers say it. Even the criminal next to Jesus, also being crucified, joins us on this and says it. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him, said, aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. They're saying, if you are who you say you are, then get off the cross. Do you see how ironic that is? Because it's impossible for Jesus to do what the criminal is asking him to do. It's impossible for Jesus to save himself and everybody else. Because today, now with hindsight, we get the why. We know why Jesus was on the cross. We know that when he dies on the cross, he's giving the payment for all of the sin in the world, all of the sin in us, for all time, and anyone who believes in him can be saved. And so if Jesus comes down off the cross, he dooms everyone. It is impossible for Jesus to save himself and everybody else because it's through his death that life is going to come. Now, I think today, when we read this, we can be tempted to look down our nose at those people. We're like, of course they couldn't do that. Don't they know he's Jesus? Don't they know what he's doing? They're asking him to do something that's impossible, but here's the thing. We can still do the same thing today. We can still ask and expect God to do things that it is impossible for God to do. Ours looks a little different than theirs does because we might say things like, God, if you really cared about me, then you would have helped me pass that test. God, if you really loved me, then you would help me find a significant other. God, if you really knew me, then you wouldn't let me be hurting and suffering right now. God, if you really cared about me, then you wouldn't let the people that I love suffer. God, if you're real, then you wouldn't allow evil and suffering in the world at all. The only difference between us and them is we can see the end of the story for them. We can see how God was going to take this thing that was causing great suffering and bring about great good. Because this suffering, it looks awful. It doesn't look good, but it was the greatest thing that had ever happened when Jesus died. It's what gives all of us hope for life, for heaven, for joy and peace. But it looked awful to the people back then. And for us today, when we're going through hardship, it can be really hard to see where God is working in the midst of it. It can be really hard to see how God is going to use the suffering, the real suffering and hurt that we're enduring, and how he's going to use it for our good. But he promises that for those who love him, he will work everything for the good. So what do we do? Because we can't see hindsight. We're stuck in the middle of our stories. We don't know yet how God's going to bring all that together. And that can be really hard when we're going through hard things. So what do? We got to do what the guy on the other side of Jesus did. The other criminal rebuked the first one. Don't you fear God? Since you are under the same sentence, we are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong. The second criminal starts confronting the first criminal and says, man, aren't you afraid? Like, we're going to die, and we're being punished for what we did. Like, we did the crime that's above our heads. This is just what is happening to us. Aren't you a little bit afraid of what's going to happen when we die? But regardless, leave Jesus alone because he's innocent. And then notice what he says next. He turns to Jesus and says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. The criminal sees Jesus on the cross and believes that he is who he says that he is. Don't you see how incredible that is? Think about that. He doesn't look very impressive. He's hanging on the cross dying. He's just some guy. He doesn't look like God. In fact, everybody else is making fun of him for believing that he's God. But the criminal, in his last moments, as he's actively dying, says, you are God. I'm being punished, rightly so. And when I die, there's nothing good that's going to happen to me. But when you get to your kingdom, remember me. That's incredible. Think about the faith that took. And notice, the criminal doesn't bring anything to the table, does he? He doesn't say, Jesus, I know I'm being executed right now, but, I really love my mom. He doesn't say, but God, I really did a lot of good things for a lot of people. Remember me when you get to your kingdom. He didn't go to church. He didn't go to Bible study. He didn't serve people. He's not bringing anything to the table. He's saying, Jesus, because of who you are, have mercy on me and remember me when you go to your kingdom. That's it. And in this story, friends, we are the criminal. The reality of our salvation is that we bring nothing to the table. Let me say that again, because I think we've heard that before, but I think we struggle to believe it. We bring nothing to the table. Nothing. Your salvation isn't about you. It's about Jesus. It's not about you. Take a deep breath. It's not about you. It's all about Jesus and his mercy. And look at what Jesus says to him. It's one of the most incredible things. Jesus answered him, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. The emphasis in this verse is on the word today, because the criminal was talking about one day. Jesus, one day, when you get to your kingdom, will you remember me? Will you have mercy on me? And Jesus returns to him and says, it's not one day, it's today. Today you will be with me in my kingdom. This means heaven doesn't have a waiting room. When we die, we get to be with Jesus in paradise immediately. That means when a believer dies, we may have tears in our eyes, we may be sad, but there ought to be a smile on our face because they are in paradise with Jesus immediately. How wonderful is that? And now we get to have our full circle moment. Remember the pin we put in the beginning? The criminals were walking with Jesus to be executed. They were with Jesus on the cross, and now they will be with Jesus in paradise. Oh my goodness. When we walk with Jesus and we have a relationship with him, it starts with suffering. It's not easy. It starts with suffering. It starts with our death, the things that we want, to the way we want to do things, to what we think is best. It starts with death, but it ends with paradise. When we're going through hard times, when we're going through suffering, we've got to trust Jesus. We've got to. We talk a lot about the cross that Jesus was on, but this criminal can inspire us and encourage us when we're going through hardship and we can't see anything good. We need to remember the other cross. Let me ask you this question. Who have you given up on? Is there someone in your life that you've given up on that you think there's just no way that they could ever find faith? They're just too far gone. There's no hope for them. Remember the criminal in his last moments as he's dying. Trust in Jesus. It's not the quantity of our faith, it is the quality of our faith, and that can happen in a moment. It's never too late. Remember the other cross. Maybe you're here and you've given up on yourself. That you think that you're just too far gone, you've done too much stuff, there's no hope for you. Remember the other cross. We don't bring anything to the table. We just have to ask Jesus to save us and recognize that we need him too. We need to remember the other cross. Maybe for you, you are overwhelmed and anxious and stressed out by doing too many things. Maybe you think I've got to do all of these good things to prove to myself or prove to others that I'm good enough, that I'm a good person. Maybe you're trying to win someone's approval. You will never, but be encouraged by the criminal. Remember the other cross. I forgot and I gave up. Growing up, my mom was very spiritual and earthy. She loved her crystals and her herbs, and she treated people really well. She treated people with kindness, and she was a great mom. And in 2015, when I was saved and I started my relationship with Jesus, started walking with him, she was supportive but skeptical. She didn't understand how I could worship a God who did so many bad things and when there's so much evil and hurt in the world. But then my mom got sick, and she was sick a lot. She was in and out of the hospital for many years. And several times I had deathbed conversations with her, where I was trying to share her the hope of Jesus. But she never believed. And eventually I gave up. I didn't hide my faith from her, but I stopped praying for her, and I stopped believing that it was possible. But then my mom got really sick, and she was in the hospital for about half of a year. And eventually, she's facing a decision where she has to get both of her legs amputated above the knee and risk recovery in a body that has kidney failure and heart failure, or she can choose to go home to die. And my mom is faced with this decision. My dad calls me and tells me that she's accepted Jesus, she's believed in him, and that she's decided to come home. She's ready to die. She's not going to do the surgery. And I heard that, and I was shocked. I'm hopeful, but I'm skeptical. I'm like, what's different this time? So I call her to talk to her about it, and she tells me this incredible way that God got her attention, and it's amazing and beautiful, but I'm still trying to wrap my mind around it. I still want to know if this is genuine or not. And so we start talking about her decision to come home. And the conversation gets pretty emotional. And I say to her, Mom, I'm really sad, and I'm going to miss you. How are you feeling? And she said, Will, I'm sad, and I'm going to miss you too. But the thing that I'm most sad about is that I'm not going to be able to tell people about Jesus now. She said, Will, I've gone through a lot of really hard things in my life, but now I know that Jesus was with me the entire time. And she said, despite all of the hard things that I've gone through, I'm so thankful that I'm here now. And she said, Will, I'm ready to go home. I was astonished and humbled by her courage and peace in the midst of such suffering and death. And so a few weeks later, when she is home and we're around her and she is dying, we're singing to her and we're reading Bible verses to her, and she takes her last breath and we all start crying. But I had a smile on my face because I knew that she was home. That's why we have to remember the other cross. Fireside Church, that is the hope that we have to share.